Welcome to the Pastor Thrive podcast with your hosts, Dr. Tim and Terry Steele. We encourage pastors, strengthen ministries, and inspire churches to thrive. This is Pastor Thrive. You don't have to lead alone.
Welcome to Pastor Thrive podcast, and we're excited about this week's podcast because our last episode kind of ended on a downer. We were talking about the emotional and cultural and spiritual issues that pastors have and how it affects their health, spiritually, emotionally, affects their marriage. And it was a bad place to stop because we didn't really give any hope. So we've invited Dr. Clint Calvert to come back and help us with a path for pastors who are having issues and they're finally ready to ask for help. And so I'm going to ask my wife to reintroduce Dr. Calvert today. So go ahead, Terry.
Again, Clint Calvert, he is our star today of episode number 2. Clint is a founder of Second Act Career Services. He's a board-certified chaplain who coaches adults to thrive in their career transitions. He has served churches in a variety of capacities as a lead pastor, as a mission pastor, and a variety of other staff roles for many years. He was the church leadership catalyst for the Minnesota-Wisconsin Baptist Convention for the past 2 decades. And he is also a clinical pastoral education training supervisor who trains chaplains and supervisory candidates. He has taught as an adjunct professor for Midwestern and Southeastern seminaries. So as you can see, he is a very busy man. So we are very excited to have him here with us today. He is married, has 3 adult children and 2 grandchildren that keep him busy as well. So welcome to our podcast, Clint. So we left off with, in our first episode, where we're going to continue on today, we talked about sometimes the rose-colored glasses that pastors have when they first enter the ministry. We talked about their journey and kind of along the way where maybe those glasses fall off and some of the realities of ministry set in. And then we talked about the ones who they almost want to give up at this point. There's so many burdens that they're carrying and they just don't feel like they can speak up. So that was where we were. Now this time in our podcast, we're going to talk about the steps towards openness and healing for these pastors that carry those burdens. So if you could, Clint, tell us a little bit about what types of things can pastors do, or should they do, or have you seen are helpful in recovering from bearing that burden alone and being vulnerable to speak up?
Well, thanks, Terry. It's good to be back with you guys. And yes, our last time was, I would say, 40 miles of bad road, and hopefully we can have 40 miles of good road here. You know, I think a lot of pastors go through this where they realize that they've been breaking the Sabbath, that they have no rest in their life. And sometimes just the very beginning of this is just making sure that you put a full day in your life where you're obeying the scripture and you're having a Sabbath. And then if you can, if possible, to see if the church might be willing to let you have a sabbatical. A lot of churches have policies where if a pastor served a number of years, let's say 7 years, that they can get some time away, a sabbatical. And I encourage pastors to really do this because they really need significant time away. And it's a sunk cost for the church. So the church has already budgeted for the salary. And so it's not going to add that much of a burden to the church to let the pastor go away. I would recommend for about 3 months. And a lot of people think that's a long time. But having done a couple of sabbaticals myself, I can tell you that I really didn't even start to relax until after really the first month of being away. And it just takes a lot of time to wind down. So I really encourage sabbaticals. And I tell the pastors, I tell the churches that if you give your pastor a sabbatical, you're going to get a new pastor one way or another. Your pastor's going to come back and they're going to be a fresh person, or they're going to be moving on. But one way or another, you'll get a new pastor out of it.
What other kinds of boundaries or work rhythms or spiritual practices would help a pastor heal?
Well, I think it could be even smaller, just not being unavailable, that there just has to be some time during the week that you're not available. We need the perspective. We need the time to reflect. And sometimes we don't realize where we're at until we've had time to reflect. And if you're constantly on the treadmill, you never take yourself off. If you feel like you always have to be the one preaching in the pulpit, let me assure you that other people can preach. And the people in your church need to hear different voices from that pulpit. What's the worst thing that can happen if somebody does a poor job in the pulpit? They'll be actually grateful to have you back. So I think you just have to create some margin around your life where you can start to reflect, because if you don't have that, you won't take the time you're going to have to take to do the other things, like to be in a fitness routine or to go to therapy or to be in some kind of peer group or have some other kind of supportive discipline. If you can't take the time one day a week to be off, or you can't take time away from the church for any significant time, then how are you going to do that as a way of life?
A good point. I find it interesting that sometimes, and I'm a church attender, obviously, right? As a church attender, pastors somehow have fallen into this 24/7 job with the rest of us that just have jobs. We don't work 24/7, but yet we sometimes hold our pastors to that higher standard. I would imagine maybe, Clint, that's something you've heard from pastors that you've talked to as well, is that feeling that it's always 24/7 and the pressure that brings as well. So setting those boundaries makes a lot of sense, right? Like we would set them for ourselves in the secular world, understanding that allowing our pastors to have some of that same freedom as well could really, things we could do just as church attenders to lighten the load on our pastors, I think would go a long way as well. Would you not agree?
And I love the idea of the secular perspective on call. So in a hospice, where if you're a hospice chaplain or a social worker, many times you have to be on call 24/7, but no one person in that practice is expected to do that all the time. So in a given month, if I were a PRN, which means as needed chaplain working in a hospice, I might have one weekend where I'm on call. Other members of our psychosocial team or other people would be on call as well. There'd be a scheduled for it. But the secular world recognizes that that's impossible for somebody to be on call 24/7. They actually pay you more money for those hours that you're on call, even if you don't get called out. And so for a pastor to bring that perspective over to the church, I think it's foolish for a lot of reasons. One is you just cannot be there all the time for everybody. That's just not reasonable. And I think you're teaching people, I think, a dependence on you as a person. And I think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was teaching and talking about how while Germany thought they needed a father and a Fuhrer, Bonhoeffer was saying things like this. He said that the leader must always disillusion. And what the idea was is that I'm not building the people's confidence in me as a person. I can build their confidence in the office of the pastor. I also think that makes a good argument for plural leadership of a church where you have other elders or deacons or people who share that. But just getting a pastor out of the frame of mind, it's not realistic to be on call 24/7. And that even the secular world recognizes that it's a special circumstance that is even accounted for with multiple staff.
So if you're going to change, you're going to change, and sometimes you're changing your ideas or shifting your ideas, and your people have not shifted yet their ideas. So you're saying, I can't be on call 24/7, but your church still thinks you're on call for 24/7. So sometimes this transformation often requires some pretty brave choices that you have to make. So what is the most difficult part for a pastor when it comes to embracing vulnerability and saying, okay, guys, we've got to change the way I'm doing this or I just can't continue?
Well, the weight, I don't think changes. I think what changes is the pastor's way of carrying the weight. And that you're still responsible for the
That's
pastoral care of
good.
the church. It's that you're not trying to take it on yourself. And I think you cultivate a discipline. And here's how you teach people in the church how to manage their expectations. I do this as an interim pastor. In other situations, people might come up and say, wow, Clint, that was a fantastic sermon. That was great. And I will literally say to them, come back next week. It's going to stink. I'll say these all cannot be home runs. And so I don't ever pretend that a great performance is going to be the baseline. because it puts me in a box that I can't possibly perform. Then you also have people come to you and say, well, that wasn't a very good sermon. My favorite preacher is, and I've had this happen where people will say, I love John Piper. And I had a lady in a church I served that would bring me John Piper's sermons for whatever I was preaching to help me, know the right way to preach it. And so I would just tell her, I would just say, man, John Piper is amazing, isn't he? Oh, yeah. He's a great preacher, isn't he? Oh, yeah. And I would just say, I'm never going to be John Piper. And I'm trying to honor her respect for that pastor, but I'm not going to put myself in a box where I have to be compared to him. I have my good days and I have my bad days, but I think the sooner that you talk plainly with people in the church, the better. And I see a lot of churches calling pastors coming to churches, and it's a recipe for disaster because the church tells that pastor whatever they want to hear, and typically the pastor wants to tell the church whatever they want to hear. And I think if you're ever going to be honest with the church and put all your cards on the table, that it's in the call, that at that time you say, here's who I am, here's who I'm not. If this is what you want, here's what I can do. Unfortunately, you're going to be disappointed in some things. I think that's 10 times better than setting up a scenario that both of you know isn't going to be true. And so just becoming honest with people early and often and letting them be disappointed and learning how to let them be disappointed. And they shouldn't have their hope and their trust in me anyway as a person. Now they can respect my office, but when they do respect my office, I actually work harder because I realize it's not about me. But I think it is a posture and it is an education, but you just have to start it from the beginning.
So managing expectations, open communication, right? I would say that from a secular perspective, the job interview process, right? The calling, it could be scary to present that because let's say you are an unemployed pastor and you're looking for that, economic help with your family. So how would you encourage pastors to go through with the managing expectations and the practical communications in light of the potential fear of not being able to provide for their family, right? I feel like there's a balance there that they would struggle with.
There is. Well, and I would, this is really kind of a lifelong discipline, but pastors have more marketable skills than they realize. There are so many hospices in America that are longing for chaplains that they're hiring all the time, and they'll hire a person with or without formal training. Now, sometimes they'll hire them and they'll want them to get training, and that's a reasonable expectation. But first of all, I think pastors should not see their ministry as just being their church. I think for me that's part of a limiting factor anyway. If your ministry is larger than your church, I mean, your church is important and your church is, but churches really, they come and they go. You only have one family, you may have many churches. But my attitude is that if you're prepared and you think about the skills you have as being marketable and more than just a church, and you're willing to be honest, I would rather go work for a secular employer than I would go work for a church where I had to be dishonest in order to get the job. Because to me, that there's just so many red flags that are there. And, I find a lot of people on pulpit committees have secular experience and they actually appreciate the candor, that they expect this is going to be God talk and fruity and all spiritual and all that stuff. And when someone just speaks truth, it actually shocks people in a good way, that, oh, here's someone who, and I think this is the issue. Most pastors their identity is so fragile, their self-esteem is so fragile that they can't envision a world where they could assert themselves this way. And I can tell you, you can. And the older you get and the more mature you are in the ministry, the easier it gets to be able just to tell people, hey, here's who I am, here's what I've got. Some of it's great, some of it's not, but here's what I can bring. And, God, I believe, will honor that honesty. And I know he'll protect and help protect the pastor who's honest that way.
That is such great advice about realizing your marketability, realizing your ministry is more than just your church. There's probably pastors listening to this who know they have problems, know they have issues, that they need more help, and they don't know what to do. So what's at stake for them if they don't speak up, if they keep it in and bottle it up? What are the consequences when pastors just never ask for help or seek some kind of support? What happens to them?
One of the handouts I like to give pastors and share with them is about a little growing past stress GPS worksheet that you do. And the story I like to tell them is about the firemen that went out to fight a fire. And ironically, their firehouse burned down while they were out fighting another fire. And I think the German word for that is Schadenfreude. And that's when you take pleasure in the pain of another person. So we shouldn't take pleasure in the pain of these firemen, right? But I know a lot of pastors, whose own house is burning down, whether it's their relationship with their spouse, their kids, or even with their church leadership or whatever. And one of the questions on this form is, what are the consequences of me not dealing with this now? Or what will this look like in 5 years? And I think just keeping the status quo compounds the problem, where the problem gets even bigger and bigger and hurts more and more people. So I think that taking a hard look at, the sunk cost thing, that if I deal with it now, I've had a lot of pain, but if I deal with it now, then I won't have so much more pain to deal with later. And so getting people just to recognize, nobody ever goes to a counselor and tells their counselor, man, I wish I would have put this off longer. What do they always say? They always say, man, I wish I would have come here sooner.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have a choice, when you're dealing with a problem. Do you want to keep putting that off and kicking the can down the road until it grows into something really grotesque? Or do you want to do something today that maybe can be helpful today?
Mm. Well, let me ask you this. For the pastors that you've talked to or the folks that you've talked to, when I assume you've seen those that have finally stepped forward, maybe asked for help, moving in that direction. What is their ministry? How does their ministry or their life change when they finally take kind of what I would call like the freedom step forward, right? Because there's a lot of freedom in truth, even though that's you're exposing things to the light. I know even for myself, there's a freedom in that. So what have you seen on the positive side for change once people take that step?
Well, I think a lot of pastors who love preaching put too much stock in their preaching. But what I don't think they pay attention to is their example and how influential their example can be. So when they take this freedom step that you're talking about, they're going to set a lot of people free, because people are going to look at their example and go, well, if my pastor can do this, I can do this, right? If he's brave enough to admit this or move forward with this, I can do that. And so I really think that our real influence as pastors is not only what happens in the pulpit, it's really what happens in our example. So to me, that's a really powerful idea, is that they're going to move into a whole new realm of influence that maybe they were thinking in terms of, I'm going to address this from a pulpit, but they're going to actually be able to address life on life as people around them see, oh my goodness, things are really changing. And then the other thing, which is so ironic, is you see pastors who go to pursue health and their church ministries explode. And it's like they stop worrying about all the little things that make the church grow, and they start taking better care of themselves for whatever reason, inexplicably. And I can name names and take you around the 2 states where I've got guys that just said, I'm going to just focus on one or two things. And because they were so focused, that their church just grew. And it's kind of hard to explain. The people around them changed. If you're a pastor and you're trying to do everything for everybody, how many people are you keeping from being activated in that body to do things? So on purposeful absence, you're going to create opportunities for people to step up and do things maybe they haven't before. And a lot of those people can do things better than we can. So if we give them more room to work, you might be surprised what happens when you do that.
If you're looking for help as a pastor, where would you start asking for help? Where would you go and say you're struggling, and where would you start going right now?
Well, I think that depends. That's kind of a complicated situation because, you know, as a person who worked for a state convention, I have a lot of trust in my state convention, and I would reach out to one of my either associational leaders or to my state convention leader. But I understand why people might find that hard to do because they don't know if they know the person, if they can trust the person. There may be somebody that you really do trust. It could be a pastor in another church. It could be someone in the church you served previously who's a strong elder or a deacon that you have a relationship with. But you can count on them to call them, and you know that they're going to be helpful to you, and they're not going to contaminate like what your situation is locally. But I would encourage you to go to that person, the person that you trust, the person that you can let your hair down with, even if they're not a qualified counselor, even if they're not a pastor. It'd be better to just have somebody that you can talk to, to get some help. And, the surprising thing about the Bible is a lot of people were helped by people that weren't quote unquote professionals. I think about Moses and Jethro and how much help Moses got from Jethro, his father-in-law. And so hopefully there's somebody in your life, just that one person that you can trust, that you could tell, and that would be the beginning. But then I would move out from there. I think I would talk to a counselor, I would talk to a therapist. I would get that kind of help because those people are trained. I personally do that. I personally engage with a therapist and find it very helpful. I encourage pastors to do that. And almost universally, the pastors who talk about it say that it is helpful to them, and you can see evidence of that in their life. But I think it starts with not being alone. Bad things happen when you're alone. I always say when you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you should halt. And if typically when we're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, we just want to isolate. We just want to go off by ourselves. And so I think the first best step is to get help earlier rather than later.
Thank you so much for sharing your heart in this episode. Your honesty may be a lifeline that some pastor out there really needs. And some of the things you said today, they really needed to hear. We are so thankful that you've joined us for the Pastor Thrive podcast. And I appreciate my wife, Terry, for helping out. We appreciate Kevin Norris, our producer, who does all the work behind the scenes. And especially we want to say thank you to our guest, Dr. Clint Calvert. Thank you so much for joining us on the Pastor Thrive podcast.
Thanks for joining us on the Pastor Thrive podcast. Keep leading with courage, keep serving with joy, and remember, you don't walk this road alone.